Hi, I'm Hannah,
And I'm Lydia.
and we are a pair of bookends.
And we were just hoping that we could interrupt this episode to ask you very kindly if you would sign up to our Patreon.
Yes, if you have some spare change rattling around in your pocket, we would so appreciate it if you could go over to patreon.com/a pair of bookends where you can support our work. We have been doing this podcast for nearly 2 years now, and we wanted the opportunity to get to know some of you a little better. And via our Patreon, as well as getting exclusive benefits, you can also have the opportunities to share your own recommendations with us and to chat with us. And it's just a nice place for us to have our own little hub.
For less than the price of a coffee, you can get exclusive Patreon only benefits, such as our Patreon exclusive book club, where you get to pick the book that we read each month, and also
Early access to all podcast episodes.
and your chance to ask our authors your own questions.
So please do, if you can, sign up to our Patreon via patreon.com/a pair of bookends and support our work. We would appreciate it more than you can imagine, and it helps us hugely to bring you all the extra special stuff.
So come and officially become a bookend.
Now, on to today's episode. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. Welcome to our book club episode for March. Today we have to deep dive into our chosen book, Unearthing, a captivating memoir of a mother-daughter relationship wrought by a DNA test and nourished by the transformative possibilities of tending a garden. An elegant and moving memoir about grief and self-identity that celebrates love in its many forms.
Maclear is an essayist, editor, novelist, and children's author based in Toronto. Her work has appeared in Orion magazine, The Guardian, Lit Hub, Brick, and Azure, amongst many other publications. Kyo holds a doctorate in environmental humanities and currently teaches writing at the University of Guelph Creative Writing MFA and Humber School for Writers. She's also an editor-at-large with Tundra Books. Her books have been translated into 18 languages and published in over 25 countries. Her books have received many nominations, including Amazon.ca First Novel Award, the Hilary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Non-Fiction, and the TD Canadian Children's Literature Awards. Her hybrid memoir, Birds Art Life, was published in 2017 and won the Trillium Book Award, and her latest book, Unearthing, a story of tangled love and family secrets, won the Governor-General's Literary Award for Non-Fiction, and is published in the UK by Pushkin Press on the 7th of March. We are so excited to be joined by Kyo today. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Lydia.
No, thank you so much. We're so excited to speak about you. I feel like all we've done over the last few days is talk about your book and message about it. And it has been such a wonderful experience to read this. So thank you so much for writing it.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. Thank you.
So we always start our podcast by asking our favourite question, which is, what are you currently reading?
So I have a stack of books beside my bed, but the one I was reading last night is I just began Wrong Norma, and it's Anne Carson's new book. And it's very much kind of prose, poetry, essays. I don't know if you're familiar with Anne Carson, but she's a kind of beacon in Canada in terms of her work in kind of ancient Greek literature, but also in poetry. And she's a real iconoclast and very much a kind of hybrid style writer who I really adore.
Incredible. I haven't actually read any of her work, so I will be adding that to my list immediately. So, onto your book, Unearthing, which, as I said, we both absolutely loved. And as Lydia mentioned in the intro, it is our March book club pick for the podcast, which is very exciting. So, I would love to start by asking about the story that led to the writing of this incredible book. So, you took a DNA test, and the results completely switched your life around as you knew it. Could you tell us about that experience and when you realised that you wanted to write about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to answer the first part of the question, I took the DNA test in 2019. My father had recently passed away, and I was really looking to find members of his kind of maternal line. I'd heard a lot about his paternal line, but his mother had given him away at a very young age to foster care in the UK. And he'd always been very mysterious about that side of the family. They were the Gallaghers. And so I just wanted to find one relative who might shed light on that aspect of his family. And I think part of it was just the grief of having lost my dad and being in Canada and having no kind of further family in like on the continent really. And so I did the test with no suspicions and then received these kind of alarming and very upending results. And so the story became one of kind of trying to figure out what had happened. I mean, it's very much a kind of DNA detective story. I think these like stories are actually increasingly common because so many
Mhm.
people are doing these DNA tests and then having these kind of jump scares and surprises and kind of unearthing all these family secrets. And so that's kind of what happened. I think I had the sense when I got the results. I mean, at first I didn't believe them. And I think, customer service representatives at these recreational genetics companies must get calls all the time from people saying, has there been an error? And I certainly didn't believe the results. They didn't square with anything I'd been told. And so I actually did a second test. And then I kind of uploaded it to a third kind of site. So I ended up with a million cousins. I still receive like notifications in my inbox every day. But what became clear to me was that I really had the sense of having, I don't know, it felt like, I don't know if you're familiar with Buster Keaton movies, but there's this famous film where the kind of house facade falls down on him,
Mhm.
and he's kind of left kind of in the square of the window, like he's kind of spared. But I did have this feeling that everything had kind of capsized. And so I wanted to kind of rebuild my story and rebuild my biography. And so I started to take notes. I don't know that I was explicitly thinking I would write a book, but I am a writer. And I think this is what writers do. We think and kind of process things through writing. And so there was all this kind of churning happening inside of me. And as I was kind of thinking it all through, the only place I found that was kind of stable was the page.
You also talk in the book about I think this is the phrase that you use. It's a search angel. Could you tell our listeners what that means?
So I mean, as I said, I had this kind of flow of cousins in my inbox, and they had all these kind of percentages beside them, and I had no idea what to make of any of it. And somebody suggested actually a documentary filmmaker in my city of Toronto who had kind of undergone something similar because he was donor conceived, told me about these Facebook kind of groups. And one of them was called, I think, DNA Detective. And so, you have to go through a process of applying because it's a kind of closed group. And I applied, and then I put up my story, and within, I think, an hour, I had people volunteering to help me. And these people, they call themselves search angels, and they're basically, a lot of them are hobbyists, a lot of them are kind of recreational genealogists, but a lot of them have like vast kind of archives of experience. And this woman in San Francisco just volunteered to help me. And she actually had like incredible sleuthing abilities. Like I couldn't figure this out. And she accompanied me for about, I guess, almost 3 or 4 months, trying to untangle all these different kind of lines of information I was getting. And anyway, so she was my search angel. And it's all like, I mean, there was no payment, it was all voluntary. I asked her later on why she did it. And she said that she's always wanted to help people. She used to work with people in homeless communities and unhoused communities. And she just really wanted to help people kind of rebuild their stories.
It's so incredible because we're told so much like not to trust strangers online. So the fact that you had such a positive experience, especially when it would have been it must have been such a scary time in your life and quite stressful. So to have somebody kind of come and take care of you in that way, like I think is just like it really gives me hope for people and humanity.
It's so funny that you say that because it never crossed my mind not to trust her. I think I was like willing to go anywhere with anyone. Like it's one of those things where you're lost in the woods and like somebody walks by and you're like, okay, that must be a guide, or that must be an intrepid kind of leader, and I'll follow them. And so I probably was too trusting to be honest, but it ended up working out fine. So
Well, that's amazing.
One of the aspects of your book is well, a pivotal part is your mother. And I have got a little quote from the book that I just have to read back at you, cringeworthily, I know.
It's for the
But
benefit of the listeners also though, Lydia,
for
like
the
it's not.
benefit of the listeners, of course. Also, Hannah, you'll be very proud of me. I actually
Very good, very good. I'm
have
glad.
marked this because I'm very excited. Basically, marked the entire book. But yeah, so this is just you talking about wanting to how to capture somebody. Monet once said, "For me, it is only the surrounding atmosphere which gives subjects their true value." I would like to be a writer who, if I cannot convey things in themselves, captures the air as it touches the world. If I cannot tell my mother's story, I want to tell her atmosphere. And I cannot tell you how amazingly you did that. It is so infused with your mother's spirit, this entire story. It's incredible. And I can only think how difficult that was for you to try and capture her essence on the page. What was that process like for you?
I'm really grateful for that comment, because the worst fears I had pre-publication were that my portrait of my mother would malfunction. That, you have all the best intentions, and I had certain ideas about how I wanted to really portray her as a faceted, complicated person. Because we had a fairly combative relationship when I was younger, and but that wasn't all. Like, it was also tender in strange ways, and kind of love was like expressed in kind of really ambient ways that I kind of didn't discern or I couldn't read or make legible for a long time. I mean, a lot of that love was expressed through the garden actually, but one thing I did know was that I didn't want this book to kind of elevate myself over anyone else. Like I didn't want it to be a book where I was settling scores with anyone because I did. There were moments where I felt kind of angry and frustrated with my parents because they had kept such a large secret from me. But I knew that that was kind of the surface first feeling that I had, and I needed to dig underneath that. And so I really wanted to kind of get to a better understanding of my mother and how this secret had shaped her character, but also how it shaped our relationship. And I will say one thing about my mother is that she's like the Houdini of storytelling. So every time I think I've got a handle on her, she kind of busts out of that box and like kind of runs away, like kind of rappels down the building and like kind of scurries off. So she didn't, I mean, she's not a reliable raconteur. She didn't really ever share her story with me openly. And so I could only get at her kind of indirectly.
Mhm.
Um, I think that was kind of the essence of it.
Yeah, I think that I came to completely fall in love with your mother. I thought you wrote her so beautifully, as Lydia said. And I think we've spoken about mother daughter relationships on the podcast quite a bit because those are the kind of narratives that me and Lydia love to read about and we feel really passionate about. And, I think me and Lydia have spoken before and said that there kind of isn't really I wouldn't believe somebody if they said they had the perfect relationship with their mother. I just don't think that exists. And I really liked that you didn't kind of shy away from writing about the sort of difficult elements of your relationship. I think it's important to show the kind of full roundedness of that. So I'm really glad that you did that because I've certainly experienced that with my own mother. And if I was to write a book about my mum, I would have to write about the issues that we might have had when I was growing up, as well as all the wonderful, beautiful moments that we've shared together. Both things exist and both things have made up that relationship. So I think it's really important that you wrote that. So I wanted to. You mentioned about your relationship with your mother in terms of you started to touch on gardening, and I would love to ask about gardening and nature and your kind of relationship to nature because I think that the way you write about it was really fascinating and the way that you explore it in Unearthing, and I know that you also wrote about similar themes in your previous book. Where do you think that your appreciation and discovery of nature began? And was it something that you felt that you found independently, or was it something that was fostered by your parents or like your mother?
That's such a good question. I mean, with this book, I think I always was surrounded by beautiful gardens because of my mother. And, as part of the process of writing this book, there was a moment when I realized I wasn't going to get to know her any better by interrogating her. That I could ask her a million questions and I wouldn't get any closer to her. In fact, I was probably pushing her away because nobody kind of wants to feel like somebody's trying to extract and kind of dig up information, like there's some kind of, I mean, hostage or something, right? So I realized that the best way to speak to my mother was actually shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. And so, I tried to meet her on her own terms and in her own space, and that space was the garden. So, I mean, just a background, like I am a plant killer. Like I do not have a green thumb, and I've gotten a lot better, but I used to always like bring my plants. Like when I was in residence at university, I would kill plants and I try to bring them to my mother for like CPR. just to, like, resuscitate them, but and so I always thought of that as her territory, and but I think also, when you feel like everything's unsettled and, like, the earth is spinning, there is a desire to go to ground, like, to actually kind of reroot yourself, and so I think it was almost intuitive, like, I needed to put my hands in the soil. I needed to do something kind of earthy and material because, I mean, part of the mystery of all this is that as I was unearthing my story, it was all happening virtually, right? Like,
Mhm.
family members I was connecting with didn't live in Canada. They were all at a distance. I wasn't seeing them in the flesh. And so there was just this feeling of being very ungrounded. And so the garden was actually literally grounding. And in terms of like nature more generally, I mean, I wrote a book before this about birds, city birds, really, because I used to think there were like 5 birds in Toronto, and it turns out we have like upwards of 400
Oh my
species.
gosh.
And it was kind of a lesson in realizing actually that we notice only a fraction of what surrounds us, and that there's a kind of vast teeming world of things that we don't notice. And I mean, that actually had an analogy in on my relationship with my mother. Like there was so much that I didn't notice about her because I
Mhm.
think mothers tend to be our scenery, like our kind of background.
Mhm.
And we take it for granted that they're just going to be there and they're going to be the kind of stage upon which we kind of enact our lives. And I think that sometimes there's a tendency not to see them, which is why I think those like projects like, My Mother Before are so interesting. Those projects where they collect photographs of women before they had kids
Mm.
and you see a facet of your mother that like pre-existed you. And it's like a realization that they were a whole character, that they had this whole kind of protagonist energy and that they had this life that had nothing to do with you. I mean, that was the sense I had. And so the garden kind of became a place where like finally I was starting to notice that I was surrounded by all these green things and they had names and they had histories, and it was like everything that was in the background came to the foreground. And part of that was also the nature around me.
Absolutely. And I feel like the way that you write about nature, it just sits so well with your story.
Mm.
And it feels as if they're like one of the same. And how difficult was it for you to kind of decide how you were gonna kind of tell this story?
Well, it takes place in like very kind of small chapters. Like there's small parcels of story, and I think the structure felt intuitive and it felt kind of natural to me because I was receiving the kind of parts of my story in these like kind of fragments and these little kind of bursts of new information. And so I kind of wanted to constellate the story out of these smaller bits and not try to create like this kind of seamless linear narrative. And I do think that when we think about ourselves and who we are and our persona on the page, we're composed of all the times of our lives. Like, and so I really want to kind of hopscotch through time and think about who I was now, who I was as a child, who my mother was, and try to create this kind of composite of who we've become through that kind of time travel. So I think that's really why it found its form. And also, I mean, the sections are named after seasons in the Japanese calendar, and they're these kind of micro seasons. And so again, I wanted to kind of show how the ground of our storytelling is always changing. Like in the North American context, we talk about, the 4 major seasons in these kind of larger units. But if you look at a kind of precise sense of the seasonal calendar in Asian cultures, you realize that actually seasons are always in flux.
Mhm.
And I really wanted to capture that sense of flux in my own story and in the world. And so, I mean, it just became the form.
I really loved the way that you formatted the book because when we first received copies of it, I thought, oh, it's quite a big one, and I wasn't sure like how long it was going to take me to read, and I completely flew through it, and I think it's because of the nature of the formatting, and also the way that you write is in this sort of like vignette style, which I completely adored, and I think that's why I inhaled it so quickly.
Yeah, I never know whether or not that's a compliment or not. If you can inhale like a life's work, in like 4 hours, but you just love it too much to stop.
Yeah.
But moving on to what I really want to delve into, and that is the way that you talk about books and writing and art and culture. And of course, for us here at A Pair of Bookends, that is exactly what we love, and it's all what we would love to consume. And once again, I'm back with the quotes because you can't stop me. But this was just a wonderful passage that I wanted to read. Books raised me, strangers raised me, Harriet raised me, Max raised me, wolves raised me. When someone asked about my origins, my first impulse was to point to my bookcase. Deep in my bones, I always understood where I came from. A person I dated wrote a poem describing how I acted like an eager librarian during our courtship, feeding her all the volumes I had ever loved. She did not see that I was taking her home to meet my family, showing her what had composed me at a cellular level as a person. These are the people, I was saying, who have built stores of thought and feeling that remain inside me.
So
I mean,
good. That
when
completely took my breath away.
yeah, when I read that, I'm just gonna have to sit and reread that
Mhm.
over and over again because it's like you were saying exactly how I feel about books and about literature. What I mean, other than obviously in your own words, but what about that subject kind of draws you to it?
I don't know where I would be without books in my life. They really did form me. And I really wanted this book to be about lineage beyond biology. And so when I think of my ancestry, I think about my literary ancestry first, like almost immediately. And so I think about all the stories that kind of built me up and also that kind of reflected things that I needed to see or that allowed me to kind of time travel or world travel. I mean, I will say one thing, which is that I had a very loving family growing up, but we were a tiny family of 3. And my parents, I think in some ways, maybe because of the family secret, were very possessive and had this kind of fierce protective love. And it was this idea that, how tight can we be? How kind of small and possessive can we be? And books kind of taught me the opposite. They said, how large can we be? How inclusive, how interdependent, how kind of boundless. And so in some ways, books kind of saved me from that kind of claustrophobic space of my childhood. And I really did, because I had no siblings, like really did rely on books for company. And that feeling, I still have it, like where it kind of you open the hinge of a door, of a book, and it feels like a door and it's a portal. And that was like a feeling that I don't think has ever gone away from me.
Yeah, I totally feel that, and I'm quite desperate to ask you a bit more on that, but I know that Lydia will kill me because I know she has a question, a question about more on that later. So I'm not gonna go into it. I will go into something else. Now, you were just talking
You
about
can, Hannah, you can.
no,
I'm
no, no,
not.
no,
I
no,
promise
no,
there won't be a
no. You
murder.
will, maybe. We never know. I wanted to ask, and Lydia's going to be even more annoyed now because I'm slipping in a question.
Oh,
But
for
it's
God's sake. Honest to God. I don't know why I bother planning. I don't know why I bother planning.
well, I must ask because it's just occurred to me. I must ask about you were still going through the experience of sort of looking and researching your ancestry during quite a difficult period worldwide, like globally. Everyone was kind of going through this horrendous period of lockdown and of COVID, and it was a really frightening time. So I wanted to ask, what was it like navigating your own personal journey, around this, as well as navigating the pandemic?
Well, I mean, I think we all had our own personal dramas that kind of
Mhm.
coincided with the pandemic. So I don't know that I was alone in that. But I think in some ways, the pandemic, because everything was up in the air and so uncertain, actually felt like I felt in sync with the world in a
Mhm.
strange way. There were so many existential questions people were asking. So, what better time to be asking existential questions? And so I felt like the kind of sense that things were in flux was actually comforting in some weird ways, even though obviously I didn't like the feeling of fear that I had because my mother, is elderly and was vulnerable, was like a part of a vulnerable community. But beyond that, I think there was this feeling. Certainly, I mean, I think I mentioned it in the book about these communities built around mutual aid and solidarity. So I also saw examples of kinship that kind of went beyond biology again, where I was really interested in the way that we were kind of becoming more interdependent or realizing how interdependent we were. If a virus can kind of hop across continents, across
Mhm.
oceans, and we're suddenly all in this really fragile ecology where we're trying to take care of each other by masking or just by staying well and not exposing other people. I think there's a sense in which our coastlines are much more porous than we think they are, and so I think I was aware that we're actually very connected. And I thought there might be like a different way of thinking about family in that period of time, beyond the kind of isolated unit. And so it was kind of an interesting time to be thinking about kinship more generally.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you sort of like we're all connected, and I think a lot of your book reminded me of the kindness of strangers and the people that helped you on this journey. And obviously, you were speaking before about the search angel, but there was also a man that helped you. And I don't know if it's, I don't think it's a spoiler to talk about this, but there is also a man that helped you during the pandemic. Do you want to tell our listeners about that experience?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think it's a spoiler. It was a botanist who lives in the Algarve in Portugal, and so I eventually in the story, and I won't reveal all the details, but I do just my biological mother was, and I decided that I would take a pilgrimage and kind of see where his last resting spot was. You know, he's buried in a tomb, a kind of mausoleum in Portugal, and so I had made a plan to travel with my son, and then lockdown happened like basically a few months before we were supposed to go. And so all the plans were kind of scuppered. And I had made a plan to take a kind of botanical expedition while we were there. And when everything closed down, like a lot of people lost work and kind of revenue. And so the guy I had been in contact with in Portugal, I knew that he had lost all his income and I didn't want to ask for my money back. And so and I also felt the sense of desiring closure, like I needed somehow to go to my dad's gravesite, my biological father's gravesite. And so this man volunteered to do that. And it was, a bit of an expedition for him. It wasn't where he lived. And he took a video of him entering the cemetery and kind of doing this kind of ritual by the graveside. And it was really beautiful. And he was a complete stranger. And it was so moving. And one of the things, because he was a botanist or kind of somebody who's familiar with plants, he saw that all the plants by the mausoleum had died because nobody had been tending the cemetery. And he was really heartbroken for me. Like, I think he wanted me to know that the grave was well tended and he saw that it had been neglected. And so he really felt sad about that. And so he actually went back a year later after lockdown had eased and he did another film and sent it to me. And this time, and this I wasn't paying for this, and he showed me that there had been new planting and that there were all these flower pots and that the grave was so beautifully tended now. And he just wanted me to feel reassured that this, like the grave, I think it said a pilgrimage for a beloved or homage to a beloved, that he wanted me to know that there was somebody who kind of loved this man. Yeah.
So
And it
it's
was
so wonderful.
Oh,
Yeah, really beautiful. I mean, I don't think there's a second of this book that I didn't love and feel totally absorbed. I felt totally absorbed by your story, and the way that you write is just, I think I've already said it, is completely breathtaking. And I really want to talk about the way that, well, I mean, the way that you write about your parents is just beautiful, and I found it really moving. But I was really intrigued by something that you write about your dad when he was reflecting on his days as a war correspondent. And I was kind of wondering about what parallels you believe that you have between the way that you approach your work and then your art and the way that your parents approach theirs. So you say your dad says that your dad said to you, sometimes you have to bury the feeling to give a report. And then you say that in his last decade, when he began making more personal films, he said, sometimes you have to bury the facts to give a feeling. Do either of those things resonate with you when you write?
Yeah, oh, I forgot about that quote. I think it actually sums up the book in some ways because when I started to try to tell the story, I went in very much as the reporter's daughter and I wanted all the facts. You know, when you feel like threatened by a kind of a surprise, you want to kind of gain your bearings again. And so I thought, okay, I'll interview everyone, I'll ask every question, I'll gather all the information, and then I'll feel settled again. I did. I interviewed so many people. I interviewed my father's ex-mistresses. I interviewed people who had known my parents. And I did gather a lot of facts, but it only took me so far. And there was a point at which I realized I had to let go of that desire and that what I was doing was kind of stifling a lot of the feelings, actually. And that I wasn't going to get anywhere with my mother by proceeding that way. And so there's a point in which the story kind of surrenders, I think. It kind of softens a bit, and I kind of let go of this desire to like nail down the truth. And I think it's a real transition in the book. And I think it's also like it was a real profound transition in my relationship with my mother when I kind of just decided I don't need to know everything. And even though it's like kind of my secret in a way, it's also her private thing. And there are things maybe she's allowed to keep. And possibly will never know.
absolutely. I think that's something that really, really touched me in the book. My own personal experience with my mother was similar in ways. My mother had a brain injury, and that meant that she lost a lot of her memories. And a lot of what you write about is about memory and the things, sometimes the way that we can change memory to suit us and to suit the narrative we want to live. And I think that there's just such a beautiful moment where you kind of this point where you just decide that you're not going to get the answers, so you're just going to spend time with your mom. And it was so moving to me, because there were times with my own mother where you kind of want to fight against what has happened or what is happening. And you think, there's a frustration that lies there, there's sometimes an anger that lies there, there's lots of emotions that come along with that. But when you do just surrender to the fact that maybe, memories are going to be hazy or unreliable, or they may say something contradictory in the same sentence, and you think, I don't know where that came from or what the truth is, but you have to sort of just let go. What was it like for you to kind of have to reconcile your need for information along with that kind of just feeling of I've just got to let this go?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful to hear you describe that with your own mother. I think that the storyteller mindset is one of control. Like when you're a storyteller, you want to line things up in a certain order. Even if you're more experimental or innovative in your storytelling, there's still the sense of trying to create a kind of order out of chaos. And I think that's partly why I'm a storyteller, because I have that tendency and that desire, not in a rigid way, but anyway, there's a bit of force involved, I think. I think it's a different mindset if you're a poet, for example. But if you're doing narrative, I think there's a certain control mechanism. So I think that the garden actually was the opposite of that, because I had the ideas of how things should go, and the garden was like, nope, we're not going to do. Mother would be like, nope, we're not going to rain for 2 weeks, or we're going to rain a lot and things are going to get flooded. And so I couldn't actually control a lot of things, or I'd have to work with what was going on around me. And so that feeling of surrender was actually really healing and helpful. And I do think that, what you just described with your mother is so resonant with me, particularly as my mother, she was in the mild and kind of stages of dementia. Now she's kind of in a more moderate stage of dementia. I've had to kind of let go of this idea of correcting or kind of finding facts, or kind of like correcting her kind of ideas about what's going on, or like it's just frustrating for her and it's frustrating for me. And I realized that what I was losing and forfeiting was intimacy. And that, sitting with her, we could actually have a lot going on and we could communicate in other ways. So that's been kind of a really nice realization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that some of what you speak about is when you stopped asking the questions, some of the answers came.
Mhm.
And I genuinely think that is a rule of life with a lot of things, especially when dealing with people who do have issues with memory or issues like my mum did. A lot of the times if you force it, it goes nowhere. But if you allow the space for them to kind of fill, they'll fill it with something meaningful. Whether or not that's the answer you're looking for, I don't know, but it's something.
I wanted to ask a question because we've spoken about the fact that the realization that we sometimes have that our parents are actually fully formed human beings outside of us as their children, and I found it really interesting, reading about you learning about your parents' life before you and whilst you were a child, and the decisions that have been made and the secrets that have been kept. And one thing in particular that surprised me was, and I'm also just going to apologise to our listeners because I'm aware that I speak about this topic a fair bit and I have done in recent episodes, but we've been speaking about this subject, which I'll come to, in terms of novels. And I think as a memoir, it's really important that we talk about the fact that this is a real lived experience, which I feel lends a new perspective to this. So I feel like you have several discoveries throughout the book that both your parents had infidelities. And I was really interested in the way that you wrote about those things, because when these things are fictionalized, they're perceived as bad. But you never seem to perceive your parents in a bad way for having done that. You just seem to think, well, the human beings, and you just have this like really great understanding of them. Why do you think that was, and why do you think that you weren't kind of tarnished by the societal perception of that sort of thing? You didn't allow it to tarnish your perception of your parents?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's a really good question. I think honestly, I grew up in such a iconoclastic, unusual home that the norms were all askew. And I think fairly early on, I had a sense that there were other things happening around me, like that we weren't this kind of cookie cutter nuclear family. My parents were big gamblers. They were always people around. There was a lot of flirting. I noticed people were always ending marriages. A lot of them were interracial marriages, and across language in particular. And so a lot of them didn't survive beyond a few years. And it was just a kind of culture where things were really unusual, I guess you could say. What was really painful actually was the fact that my parents tried to cosplay normalcy. They tried to pretend like things were that they were, they never actually even divorced because they thought it would be too scandalous in a certain way. Like, it's just bizarre, right? So they still lived with these really antiquated perceptions and tried to have like maintain the ruse of having this marriage. And it's actually, I think, the source of their unhappiness was that they had to play and charade this kind of idea. And really, like, they would have been much happier, I think, if they had kind of been born 20 years later. And I do think one of the things I think a lot now about family secrets is that they're created under pressure, societal pressure, and like things that might have been secret back then wouldn't be secrets now. I think maybe, even things like people being closeted or people like hiding illnesses or affairs, like there are a lot of things obviously that still are considered secretive in some families and communities, but I think there's a kind of greater openness. And so I do feel like there's a kind of just that feeling that I needed to look at the history of the moment as well, and place them in context.
I think it's that word openness that you just used then, that's exactly how you approach writing about this topic, and your discovery of both the fact that both your mother and your father had these affairs, and you really do approach it with this openness that I don't think I've really read before, and definitely not very often. So I really appreciated that, and it gave me kind of a whole new perspective to that topic, so thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I will say one thing, which is that I think my parents, the reason they were so secretive was that they had self-judgment. I think my mother had this idea that I would judge her, that she would be judged. She internalized a lot of shame. And I do think that what I realized was that all that stuff had kind of clogged the passageways of my family for so long that I needed to kind of like run kind of water through all those passageways and clear everything out, get things unstuck and unjammed, and just kind of like be very open. I do think that, like, I think maybe I was doing it in part for my sons because I do think, inheritance isn't just what we kind of get from our ancestors, it's also what we carry forward. And so I kind of wanted to say, like, well, let's kind of let this be open now, let's untangle all these tangled lines and let's see how we can proceed in a kind of more open and a gentler way.
Absolutely. And I feel like that really comes across in the book. There is this openness and there's subjectivity but without judgment. And I think that is such a wonderful thing to read
Mhm.
because it's so hard sometimes to not lay judgment. And I think that you definitely you show your parents in a stark light, but it's a loving light. Absolutely. Before we let you go, I do have to ask you, and Hannah's like, she knows it's a
I'm
loaded
ready.
question. But I have to ask you my favourite question ever, which is what are your literary influences? Because when you read this book, you mention so many fantastic people. You quote people, it's not just writers, it's artists. There's so much culture in this book
Mhm.
that it just feels so brilliant to read. So please can you just like give us a little hint as to some of the people that you have been influenced by?
Oh, wow. It's funny. It's as soon as you asked that, I kind of went back to earlier in my life because I think, okay, so from childhood, I would say Maurice Sendak, just because I think he really valued children and didn't speak down to them and saw that children are capable of really complicated emotions and thoughts. And I think just, I remember my childhood so vividly, and I remember the existential questions I had. And so just to have somebody honor that when I was little was really meaningful. and I think paved the way to me becoming a writer eventually. Said my questions were valid, that my fears were valid. And then I think later on, who was really formative, and I don't know if I write about him in the book, but John Berger,
Mhm.
a very well-known British writer who then ended up kind of living in rural France. But he really modeled a kind of form of digressive, almost interdisciplinary writing that I really love, like where he could bring in art, but also talk about family and relationships, and like that there were no kind of silos. And also within genre, like he would use poetry and prose, and like he'd mix it all up. So he kind of gave me permission to approach the page much more generously, without a sense of kind of like being locked into a genre. So I'd say those two people, and then the artists, like I don't know, musicians. Like I feel like my writing is so inspired by people in other practices.
Yeah,
And
and
you can tell.
you can absolutely tell it feels like such a celebration of arts and culture, and I know that both me and Lydia absolutely loved it so much, and we cannot recommend this book enough to our listeners. And I'm so excited to get to chat with more people about this book, because it really was such a wonderful experience reading it. The last question that we like to finish on is if you have any recommendations that you would like to share with our listeners of things you've been enjoying recently, I should say.
So I'm trying to think. I mean, I can tell you that I'm really looking forward to My Brilliant Friend season 4. I don't know if you followed the Elena Ferrante adaptation of the books into television, but
I've only just read My Brilliant Friend for the first time, so I definitely want to watch this. Where is it available?
I don't know where it streams in the UK. But I will say that the season 4 is coming out in the summer, and so that will be the final season.
Oh my
So if
gosh.
you're interested, you should catch up because it's the most beautiful television I've ever seen. Atmospheric, so evocative of a time. The soundtrack's incredible. So I would say that would be my kind of my recommendation.
Amazing. Well, that's what a treat that I've got to speak to you now, and now I know about that. Yeah, thank you so much, Kio. It's been such a pleasure to get to chat to you today. Where can our listeners find you on social media? Are you on there?
I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook, but not as active on Facebook.
Okay, perfect. We will link that in the show notes, and of course, we'll be linking your wonderful book, which I believe will be out. Is it out the day that I publish this episode, Lydia?
It is.
It is. Okay, well, that's very exciting. All of our listeners, please go grab your copies and come and chat to us about it, because
I'm
we
just
loved it so
holding
much.
mine.
Lydia is
Just
cradling
holding,
her copy right now.
cradling it, cuddling it. I
um,
can't let it go.
so, listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, as it helps us immensely to reach more listeners. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And lastly, Kio, thank you so much once again for joining us today. It's been such a joy.
So thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you. And goodbye.